program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
This is Edwin Newman inviting you to Meet the Press, coming to you today from Detroit.
Meet the Press, America's press conference of the air, and winner of every major award in its field, is a public affairs presentation of NBC News.
Our guest today on Meet the Press is the mayor of Detroit, Jerome P. CAVANAGH, whose city has just experienced the worst racial violence in modern American history. Mayor CAVANAGH, elected in 1961, is one of the nation's leading spokesmen on urban affairs and is the only mayor to have served simultaneously as president of both the United States Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities. We'll have the first questions now from Bill MATNEY of NBC News.
Mr. CAVANAGH, President Johnson has asked this question, and people across the nation are asking this question. Why? Why Detroit? You've had 7 days to study the situation. Do you have any answers now?
Well, Mr. Matney, I think that really it's sort of a geographic happenstance that this broke out in Detroit. By that I mean that it's a national malady, that which occurred in Detroit and could just as easily have happened in any other major American city or any other city even smaller than Detroit, any place in the United States. That may sound sort of defensive, but really it isn't. I think Detroit, by anyone's standards, had done at least all the textbook things in relation to dealing with some of these urban problems, and still it broke out. So it indicates to me that it was more than just a local problem. There were all sorts of reasons. We could sit here all afternoon probably and talk about them. Basically, we were dealing or confronted with thousands of people that felt alienated from our society, that proposed to take the law into their own hands and violate that law, that weren't bound by any of the precepts that you and I understand which constitute regular law and order in this country.
Of all the big city mayors, your ties and communication with the Negro community were considered just about as good as anybody could get. And yet this happened. What broke down? What went wrong?
Well, I think the ties which city government had and still has with certainly much of the Negro community, the vast percentage of members of the Negro community in this city is still good. But still, there are people in this as well as every city in the country that are outside of our society, not just a white society, but a society in which most of the Negroes and most of the whites belong. And given the slightest provocation, many instances even no provocation is needed, the law is taken into their own hands, and you can characterize it as protest, you can characterize it as resentment. They've been popularly fashioned as the have-nots. I think all of those things are probably apt characterizations, and certainly I don't know of any government in America, local government, state government, or national government, or any institution for that matter, that is communicating in any way or carrying on any kind of a dialogue with the so-called have-nots.
Let's get a bit more specific, Mr. CAVANAGH. There's been strong criticism, and a great deal of it is coming from the Negro community, that the riot could have been avoided had your police department moved in early Sunday morning and squashed the thing when the atmosphere was pretty much fun and games and people were standing around laughing and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that there's a great deal of that criticism both here and around the country. I really don't lend any substance to it, and I'll tell you why. I don't think it deserves any substance. The tactics which were used this year by our police department last Sunday morning were the same tactics that were used by our police department a year ago in this community when we had a potential riot. We had some very serious incidents with which I'm sure you're familiar out on the east side. Our police department moved with speed but restraint and with what we thought was reason and order. And this series of incidents didn't balloon into a riot. And everyone around the country credited the moderation or the restraint or the order which the police department exercised that morning. Now, the same tactics were used last Sunday. It is not and has not been our position in this city, nor has it been really in most of the major cities, I think, their position, to move in bristling with a lot of hardware and weaponry when you have mobs out on the street, because it's been proven time and time again that generally this just incites people into further violence and further rioting. Frankly, what happened was the fact that our police department, when it moved in, and incidentally Sunday morning in any big city is almost like Pearl Harbor on Sunday morning, at least like it was back in 1941, we're at our weakest. There are fewer men on the streets, though, at that period of time. And when our police department moved in, the crowd just overwhelmed them. And we were attempting to protect firemen when they were fighting fires, and our primary concern at that point, and these were field decisions which were made, by the way. There was no order came down from high, from me, or from the commissioner of police, do not shoot. At no time during the week did I issue any order of that kind or any other kind in relation to police procedure to the police department. But the police department has been instructed in this city over the years by its professional police leaders that they are to use such force as they deem necessary and as the circumstances deem necessary. And if they can apprehend a criminal without the use of force, then that's what they're attempting, or that's what they should attempt to do. Now, it was their judgment out on the street that morning that these rioters and looters were just going to overwhelm them if they shot into the crowd, so they refrained initially from shooting in many instances.
Thank you, Mayor Cavanaugh. We'll be back with Meet the Press and more questions for our guest, Mayor Jerome Cavanaugh, but first this message.
Now, back to Meet the Press. Please remember, questions of the panel members do not necessarily reflect their own point of view. Here is our moderator, Edwin Newman.
Resuming our interview from Detroit, our guest today on Meet the Press is Mayor Jerome P. Cavanaugh. You've just met Bill MATNEY of NBC News. The other reporters on our panel today are Martin Hayden of the Detroit News, Ames Johnson of the Washington Star-Syndicate, and John Steele of Time and Life. Lawrence E. Spivak, permanent member of the Meet the Press panel, will be back next week. We'll continue the questions now with Mr. Hayden.
Mr. Mayor, going back to the subject that Bill MATNEY raised about action at the time the riot started, one of the ranking officers in the field was an Inspector Paul Donnelly, who yesterday retired from the department. This had already been arranged. He was in charge of 2 squads of commandos who were at 14th and Euclid Street, kept there idle, then finally moved farther away to the 10th Precinct Station because they were attracting crowds. And on the eve of his retirement, without naming anybody, he says the politicians held the police back from effective control and said specifically if we had been permitted to go after the looters and troublemakers on 12th right from the start, we might have stopped it. Now, what about it? Do you agree with the inspector?
No, I certainly do not agree with the inspector. I don't know of any politicians downtown or any place else that gave any kind of instructions to our police officers, especially in those early morning hours about which you're speaking, in relation to their conduct. As a matter of fact, Inspector Donnelly, when he was questioned by our police commissioner about that specific reference which he made in your newspaper, he indicated he wasn't talking about the politicians in Detroit. He was talking about politicians sort of as a euphemism, I suppose, for people that have handcuffed police officers, generally speaking. He was one of the commanders out there. And we had given the field commanders, as they always do in situations like that, certainly broad authority to use whatever force, whatever tactics, whatever means are necessary to contain the situation or deal with it as they see best. I wasn't then, nor all during that day, for that matter, was I familiar with the exact tactics that were being used in the field, because these are police matters, professional police matters. It's always been my policy in the 5 years which I've served as mayor to allow the professionals in the police agencies or any other of those agencies to do those things, particularly in times of stress, which they knew better than anyone else.
Well, Mr. Mayor, in retrospect, now that it's over, and not knowing why it started here, if it starts next Sunday again, would we do things differently right at the start?
Well, I think, in all candor, that I would have to say to you that the role of the police officer and the definition of his authority and his authority to act out on that street should be more clearly defined. We assume that it was clearly defined in the minds of the men, in the minds of certainly their sergeants and their lieutenants and their inspectors. I think it was, generally speaking, but obviously in the minds of some, as evidenced by the remark made by Inspector Donnelly and evidenced by remarks made by other police officers, that they were, if not unsure, at least a little dubious at times about exactly what role they should be taking and what role they should be playing. I talked to a number of police officers, and if I might just quickly bring my answer to a conclusion on that one, that were out on the scene that morning. One, a patrolman, very interestingly told me just the other day that he said he was one of a squad guarding a fire company that was fighting a fire early there on 12th Street early that Sunday morning. And the mob was all around them, looting down the street. The sergeant in command of that squad ordered them not to fire at those looters, many of the looters being mothers and fathers with 7- and 8-year-old children walking along on, as Mr. Matney said, sort of a carnival-like spirit, garnering up groceries and shoes and things like that. They said their primary function at that point was to guard the firemen, to guard the lives of the firemen, guard the lives of the people out in the neighborhoods. And this policeman said to me, and he's a veteran police officer, and no particular friend of mine, I'd never met him before, he said that as far as he was concerned, had any man in that squad fired at that crowd, that whole squad of police officers probably would have been wiped out by that mob. And certainly he agreed with that field decision which was made at that point.
Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Cavanaugh, in response to Mr. Matney's original question a few moments ago about why the riots struck Detroit, you said that it was a geographic happenstance, a national malady, and it is more than a local problem.
Yes.
My question is, what can the nation do to get back on the track? And to be more specific about it, in a larger framework, just going back 3 years ago, President Johnson was traveling the country, declaring war on poverty, promising to lead Americans toward a great society, and today he's asking Americans to pray for the violence that afflicts us.
Yes.
What can we do about this?
Well, I think the first thing that has to be done is the indifference, which is expressed in the Congress almost daily. We have, gentlemen, in my judgment at least, a highly reactionary Congress in the broadest sense of that term. And this is reflected, unfortunately, at times even in the administration. But there's no question about the fact that the administration has proposed program after program to the Congress, and the Congress just seems to ignore it. They laugh and holler and rail when they vote down a minor rat control bill for the cities, and yet pay 2 or 3 or 4 times that amount of money just for the storage of cotton in any one year. We have great difficulty even getting through the Congress's $75 million appropriation for summer programs. And yet compare that to the $70 billion that this country has committed for defense. There's a madness in the country, and the Congress reacts by being indifferent. Sometimes not just indifferent, just by being completely negative about it. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done, and one of the first things certainly is a change on the part of the attitude of the people in this country, and hopefully it will be reflected in the Congress. And I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to develop this as we go on. I don't want to take up too much of your time.
When you say there's a madness in the country and you refer to the billions of dollars for defense, are you alluding there also to the war in Vietnam, which many critics this week, Senator Fulbright among them, linked again as a direct relationship between the urban violence and our commitment overseas?
All I know is that I've yet to really convince myself in my own mind that what will it profit this country if we, say, put our man on the moon by 1970, and at the same time you can't walk down Woodward Avenue in this street or this city without some fear of violence or fear as to your own safety and security. And we may be able to pacify every village in Vietnam over a period of years. But what good does it do if we can't pacify the American cities? And the American cities aren't pacified. There's no question about it. What I'm saying, really, Mr. Johnson, is that our priorities in this country are all out of balance. There's no question about it. I'm not too sure what we have to do to change those priorities, but maybe Detroit was a watershed this week in American history. And it might well be that out of the ashes of this city comes a national resolve to do far more than anything we've done in the past, because what we've done has been proven to be not only inadequate, but certainly I think we have to take some whole new directions and new looks in this country at our dealings with the urban affairs.
Mr. Steele.
Mr. Mayor, you've already said that the rioters were somehow outside of society. Do you really believe that increased federal funds, say, for education and housing and other city problems would have made any difference, and that those riots of this summer, not only in Detroit but elsewhere as well, would have been avoided? Is it a matter of money, in other words?
Well, I think much of the answer does boil down to money. I know that may sound like a very simple response to a very difficult question, but there's no doubt about it. Expectations have been built up by not just federal officials, but local officials about what those programs, those federal city programs would do. And then when the programs are cut back and sniped at, really, they only nibble at the real periphery of the problem. They never really get at the heart of it. What we have to do in this country, and long ago we declared a commitment to do it, but we've never really done it, and that is provide full employment in this country. And the government, I think, the United States government should be the employer of the last resort. That if through the public or private sectors it's impossible to obtain employment, that the United States government should guarantee the opportunity for employment. Maybe not guarantee a job, but at least the opportunity for a job. This isn't a new concept. I think President Roosevelt back in 1944 first suggested it. But we need jobs, and certainly we need a far greater involvement on the part of the private sector. There's a lot of government people in this country today, both federal, state, and local, that like to talk about the need to involve the private sector. And yet government, as yet in this country, has not defined very clearly, if at all, the areas into which the private sector should be moving.
Well, now, Mr. Mayor, not only in Detroit, but elsewhere in the country, in the civil disturbances, there's been almost no dialogue so far as I have been able to find out concerning the problems which you've mentioned, concerning jobs, housing, health, welfare. It doesn't, do you think that, that those subjects are really the answer to looting and insurrection? These are not riots over better education. The people rioting don't even talk about them. They're looting stores. How do you square that with education?
Well, Mr. Steele, the fact that, and I'm sure we could demonstrate it by examining the records of the 4,000 or 5,000 people that have been arrested, that they just have not been very significantly, I'm sure, in most instances involved in our educational process in this city, and the same would be true of most cities in the country, Newark or any other city that had a riot. So education certainly speaks and addresses itself, or the lack of educational opportunities, to the causes of riots. So does the provision of jobs. So does housing. Our housing situation in this country is a national disgrace. No one seems to be talking about it. It's estimated we need about 2 million new housing starts a year in this country. Last year, we had, as I'm sure you gentlemen know, less than 800,000 housing starts in the whole country. That's the lowest since 1946. And most of those housing starts were in middle and upper middle income areas. Why aren't we building low-income housing, either publicly or privately? Well, publicly, we know the reasons, because this Congress seems to think that the country shouldn't have it. But privately we're not building it is because there's no incentive or no profit that's been developed by the government for the private developer.
Mr. MATNEY.
Mr. Cavanaugh, you have said this rioting was not racial in the traditional confrontation of white and black, such as occurred here in 1943. But nevertheless, it was racial. You and I both know this.
I won't disagree.
In the sense that there was almost pinpoint accuracy in the firebombing throughout this city. It's very obvious that the vengeance and the wrath was directed at the white businessman. And in walking the streets of the riot area, I've been told time and time again that, Whitey, don't come back. We don't want you in here. Now, if this is true, and if this is widespread, then what about your plans for the redevelopment of this city? What sort of voice do you plan to give to these people in the ghetto who are being so vocal about this?
Mm-hmm. Let me first preface my answer by saying that the usual and the classic kind of race riot that we've been led to believe exists in this country, a white mob against a Negro mob, did not happen in this city, as you know. But I agree with you, and let's be frank about it, that the underneath the surface, that this in fact was a race riot and a race revolution. It did involve the races, particularly the Negro race. Now, it is our plan to involve as best we can, and we're making every effort just in the last week or so to involve some kind of participation, as full as we can get it, from the residents of the neighborhoods involved. We've been trying to do this in the poverty program. We've been trying to do it in some of the other programs. We haven't succeeded completely, but we've succeeded to a better degree than a lot of people would give us credit for. Let me just say, in relation to the poverty program, I'm sure all you gentlemen will be interested in this, we've done some fast analysis of the 5,000 young people that are in our neighborhood youth corps and other youth programs connected with the poverty program here. Only 3 of those 5,000 were involved in any kind of illegal activity. And I'd hesitate to contemplate how many more people would have been involved in this riot this week had we not had a poverty program.
Less than 4 minutes, gentlemen. Mr. Hayden.
Well, Mr. Mayor, do I understand you to say that this is going to keep up? I mean, for you as the mayor of the 5th biggest city, to say this is going to keep up till Congress passes legislation and gets these long-range programs into effect and builds housing and gets job equality and education, all of which is a matter of years.
It shouldn't be a matter of years, and I don't think that we can wait. Excuse me, Martin, I didn't want to interrupt your question, but I am saying that when the National Guard and the federal troops leave here, and when law and order is restored, as it just about is in our city today, there's no assurance that I can give to you, nor can anyone really give to you, that a week from now or 2 weeks from now or a year from now that the same thing won't happen. It won't happen here, it won't happen in some other city. Because until we get at these root causes, and until we start to provide things like that great American Pat Moynihan has suggested, I think, a children's allowance. He makes the point that we're the only industrial democracy in the world that doesn't have a children or a family allowance, and yet we seem to be the only industrial democracy that every summer has race riots in all of our cities. Until we start to do these things, provide some guarantee of money or income for all of our people in this country, and until the Congress begins to realistically deal with the problems of the cities, we're going to have not just a continuation, but I'd say, and it's terrible to contemplate, we're going to have some things far, far worse. It may well be that Washington, D.C., and I hate to think of this, and I would pray that it would never happen, but if what happened in Detroit this week happened in Washington, D.C., this might lift the veil off the eyes of the members of Congress.
Mr. Johnson.
Well, let's hope it doesn't happen in that city.
No, I hope so.
I would like to ask you whether you had any advance warning of the riots. I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, that you had some sort of intelligence system set up to try to find out, detect trouble in the Negro community, and that apparently it failed. Is that correct?
Yes, I'd have to be candid and say we had such a system set up, the Mayor's Summer Task Force that worked out of my office 24 hours a day ever since the summer began, not just for informational purposes, but also to coordinate our summer programs. And even though we had we could fairly well pinpoint if trouble was to happen, that it would happen probably in the 12th Street area, I cannot in honesty say to you that we had advance knowledge or notice or information that on that day this was going to happen.
Mr. Steele.
Mr. Mayor, now you've said that politicians, which presumably includes yourself, and I use that in the most respectful sense, I happen to like politicians, had no responsibility for the handling of the police force in the field. You've indicated the chief problems of meeting the city's needs are in Washington. Now what, as mayor and president of the Council of Mayors, do you anticipate cities to do?
Well, cities are really swimming upstream. Cities are doing more than any other agency of government in dealing with these problems. They have all the problems, they have the fewest resources, and as Professor Galbraith once said, you couldn't structure a worse design than we have in America. The cities and the local governments, the mayors, have all the problems of crime, delinquency, we can tick them all off. The states traditionally have ignored their responsibility in this area, and the federal government deals almost semi-apologetically with them.
Mr. Matney, quick.
Where do we go now, Mr. Mayor, immediately?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that could be done. One thing, by the way, rather than strengthen...
one.
All right, just one. Rather than strengthen the riot control training of the National Guard, I think, and I think it would be appropriate if the federal government undertook, for example, to
I have to interrupt you, Mr. Mayor. Sorry, our time is up. Thank you, Mayor Cavanaugh, for being with us today on Meet the Press. I'll tell you about next week's guest after this message.
For a printed copy of today's interview, send 10 cents in coin and a stamped, self-addressed envelope to Merkel Press, Box 2111, Washington, D.C., 20013.
Next week on Meet the Press, our guest will be Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York. Now, this is Edwin Newman saying goodbye for Mayor Jerome Cavanaugh, and Meet the Press.
Join us each Sunday for News in the Making as the nation's top reporters put challenging questions to world leaders on Meet the Press, America's press conference of the air.